Thank you all for being here. As I said earlier, I'm looking forward to this. There will be a handout to go with this talk. That was due to a miscommunication. It didn't get printed, but it is coming. The slides will also be put online after this. So please don't feel the need to take photos, because the slides will be, you will have the actual slides. You'll not need your cell phone photos later, unless you really want them for some reason, in which case, okay. So today I'm talking about the geography and history of Japan. The statistics part is really just on the next slide. By way of comparing Japan to California, sort of to give us a current baseline, to kind of grasp the country as something other than a collection of islands. And the other thing I'm going to do is then go back and talk about sort of the geography of the Japanese islands, some of how it influences the history, and then sort of go in the second half of the talk into kind of a broader overview of Japanese history. The standards for medieval Japan for the 7th grade still cover a huge amount of time in sort of their chronological sweep, everything from the extremely overblown Prince Shotoku in the 600s to, I think it ends with the Warring States period and the Tokugawa reunification, which is 1,000 years of history in which things did actually happen and change, despite arguments to the contrary that some people wanted to make. So, with that being said, we are going to move into the next portion. Oh, and I took all the photos in this presentation, so. This is in Tokyo, as you can probably guess by the ginormous sky tree in the background. This is the Abbot's Garden of Asakusa Sensoji Temple, which is one of the more famous places in Tokyo. This was has been opened for the past couple of years in the spring, in cherry blossom season, as a fundraiser for Tohoku earthquake victims, who are still not getting a lot of money out of the government. So private organizations have stepped up to try and give them enough money to move on with their lives. Let's see, okay. So comparing California versus Japan, I changed the year to 2017 on the slide, but all the statistics are from 2 years ago, 2015. So Japan is on the right and California is on the left. So in some ways they are actually a decent comparison. Not in terms of population, 39 million people live in California versus 127 million in Japan. As of 2015, 38 million of them lived in Greater Tokyo, which for those keeping track at home is more than the entire population of all of Canada. Not too much more, but more. So in terms of landmass, however, they are actually somewhat comparable. California, slightly larger, 64,000 square miles. Japan, on the right, slightly smaller, 146,000 square miles. So they are also very comparable in terms of rates of urbanization. Japan, 95% of people live in an urban area, versus California is 93%. Am I doing this right? No. I knew I should have done it. Right, okay. Forget what I just said. 95% of people in California are urbanized, versus 93% in Japan. But if you look at the density of people, in California, it's 246 people per square mile. But Japan, over there on the right, is 873 people per square mile. Which is quite remarkable and explains a lot of things about Japanese society, and in particular their public transit systems. So for those interested in the general US population, 81% urbanized, 91 people per square mile is the US average, which is shockingly low. In terms of gross domestic product of the economy, if California were a separate economy, if CalExit happened, we would be the 8th or 9th largest economy in the world by GDP. Japan sits comfortably at 3rd. And the other huge difference, of course, is population growth rate. So for 2010 to 2015, California's population grew faster than the US average, 5.08%, versus 4.1% in the US overall. In 2013, actually I think this is 2015, 2015 as well, the population growth rate in Japan was negative. It was negative 0.2%, which means that there are more people dying than being born. And that rate of population shrink, as they call it, is actually predicted to accelerate in the future. So to get more negative. Okay, oh, I should say, this photo is from Nara. This is looking out from the porch of Todaiji, the great temple, which was mentioned in the smallpox reading, I believe. And this is Mount Aso, a volcano in the central Japanese Alps, which exploded in the 1740s. Under this lava field, about 200 or 300 meters deep, is the remains of a village. Several villages, actually. So, okay. I have like the notes. Okay. So Japan's history has been deeply structured by its geography. I don't know if there's a comparative sort of way to frame that, but certainly Japan sits on the Ring of Fire. By most measurements, it is the most seismically active country in the world. And so because of its position sort of on the edge of the world and on the Ring of Fire, you get sort of the unique confluence of circumstances and some very present economic, agricultural forces which have shaped Japan's historical development for the past several thousand years, if not longer, but we don't have writing for those past, so we have to take the word of the archaeologists for it. So a good chunk of this lecture actually sort of comes out of the work of Karen Wigan, who's a historian trained as a geographer, who is a past head of the department at Stanford down south. I don't know if she still is head of the department there. But in her phrase, mountains are Japan's spine, but water is its core. So what do we mean when we say mountains are Japan's spine? This is a topographical map. If you look at the brown and yellow parts, those are basically the places where it's, the brown is more or less sort of impossible to grow things there. The yellow is also not good. Because Japan is on the Ring of Fire, the archipelago is, that means geologically it's a very young land. So those of you who may remember your sort of geography lessons from long ago in elementary school, the younger a range of mountains is, the steeper it is. Hence, mountains in California, Sierra Nevadas, versus, in America, the Appalachians are a very old mountain range. They're tired, they've slumped. You can grow things on them. But Japan has the exact opposite problem. Just 12% of the land is arable, which meaning that it's suitable for agriculture, which for most of Japan's history has been wet rice paddy agriculture, but you can grow other things in the uplands too, even if rice is unsuitable. But all of that together is just 12%, and this is also where everybody has to live, more or less, except for in 2010, 7% of the population basically lived in the mountains. We can infer probably in history the rates were similar. So what this means is that in terms of geography, it's very difficult to get across these mountains at basically any point. Even now, the train connections between Tokyo, which is here, to the Sea of Japan coast, which is here. This is the Sea of Japan, or if you're from Korea, it's the East Sea. Even now, these train connections are difficult and take a lot of time. They only completed the Shinkansen from Tokyo to Kanazawa 2 years ago. Before that, you were stuck with a limited express train. So Japanese civilization sort of organized itself more or less around the inland sea. I do have a bigger map of this later. But this is what's called the inland sea in here, in between the three main islands. So this is Honshu, which means the main island. Kyushu, which technically means the 9 provinces, and Shikoku, the 4 provinces. So Kyushu, as you can note from the map, is actually the one that's closest to Korea, and then off the map over here, if this were a map, mainland China. Shikoku has always been kind of a backwater. And Honshu here in this area, which is where Osaka, Kyoto, Nara are, that is where Japan's civilization, sort of organized society, first arose in a very centralized way. That's a statement I could qualify at length if I were giving a much more in-depth lecture, but I'm not. So we'll just move on. But basically, in terms of trade, from this part of Kyushu in the north to the southern part of South Korea, it's 125 miles. It's a much longer distance from here to China, the equivalent of about what is now modern Shanghai, Jiangsu province. What else did I want to say? Right. So basically, what you wound up doing, instead of trying to get over the mountains, which this is dangerous, difficult, steep, instead, people wound up taking boats in and around the inland sea. So this is sort of how the idea of this watery core came about. That rather than sort of trying to go over the mountains, you just take a boat to talk to people instead. Much easier. Okay. All right, so here is a bit of a zoomed out map. This is courtesy of Google. It's difficult to get kind of a good scale map that shows everything I wanted to show. But here again is sort of Japan satellite version. This map, you can also see Hokkaido up here. This is the fourth of the main islands. It constitutes about 20% of Japan's arable land, but only has 5% of its people. It was colonized by people from the mainland in the 1870s, more or less. So before that, it was kind of had various statuses, not entirely formally controlled by the government in the mainland. So it is sort of not part of the story in the medieval era to a large extent. But as Karen Wigan herself has pointed out, people in Hokkaido who the natives are known as Ainu. Before that, they were known as the Amishi, and other peoples you may see crop up in texts from the medieval era. They were plugged into the Greater North Asian nomadic society. Up here is Russia. In fact, this is Russia too, because the war has not ended. There is no treaty between Russia and Japan over the status of these islands. They've been occupied since 1945. So up here is Sakhalin, and then the Kuril Peninsula, Kamchatka. So through this circuit up here, the nomadic society of the Amishi and then the Ainu was plugged into the continent that way, but different than the settled agricultural society of people who were eventually known as the Yamato, and which in the textbooks is just always called the Japanese. So here's Korea, which of course at the time was all one thing. Well, actually it was 4 things, maybe 5, but by the time of the roughly sort of late 660s, Korea was unified under one kingdom. And here, of course, is China. So this is the southern coast. The Chuanzhou trade circuits from the 1200s came up earlier. I think this trade circuit is named the Chuanzhou Circuit. I'm looking for John. Where is he? I don't know. Hi. The Chuanzhou Circuit is the name of it, right? Right. So Chuanzhou is down here in Fujian province. It's close to Taiwan. But at the beginning of sort of Japanese history in the 500s, trade was much more likely to be coming out of Jiangsu and the Zhejiang area, which we actually partly know through the writing system in Japan because it was adopted from China. That's a whole other story. Okay. Yeah.
In comparison to the English Channel, how much bigger is the gap between Japan and South Korea?
Right. Great question. This is a comparison that comes up fairly quickly. Both the UK and Japan are these archipelagos off of these larger continents that at one point sort of dominated the continents of which they were neighbors with these large empires. The English Channel is about 30 miles wide, but this is 125 miles. So it's considerable, but you can make it in a hydrofoil in about 4 hours. Slower conventional ferry is about 10. But in fact, what wound up happening was a samurai family was given control over that. No, that's Jeju, this island. Or maybe was it this one? One of them. samurai family is given a little island and told, now you get to run trade with Korea in the Edo period, as partly a way to sort of be like, you're going to be our experts permanently. But of course, in the modern period, when Japan decided it wanted an empire, Korea was very conveniently close. And they thought, well, let's go for it. But yeah, that's in the modern times, the influence goes from Japan to China and Korea, which is a huge historical inversion in terms of patterns. Normally, it was civilization, trade goods, advanced technologies coming out of China and Korea and going into Japan. And yes, people in the modern period were very excited that they had managed to turn the tables. Yes, in the back.
Is there a genetic relationship between the Ainu and the Yamato?
That's a good question. It's on one level hard to know. There are, by some counts, only about 30,000 Ainu individuals left. That said, you know, if you looked at sort of a person who is Ainu and a person who is Japanese, they clearly don't look the same. So there's clearly different ethnic types going on. There are also other ethnic groups in the Okinawan Islands, which is this whole chain, but this is the major ones. There's actually multiple ethnic groups in Okinawa, many of which have only a few members left, but some of which are larger. So the islands are clearly a different sort of set of ethnic groups. The genetic makeup of the Japanese themselves is kind of complicated. There's a lot of arguments about it, just like there's also a lot of arguments about the relationship between Japanese and Korean in terms of language. Is there an actual relationship, or is it just really similar? That is still something that linguists argue about. But definitely sort of the people who are Ainu are of a different ethnic group and extraction than the people who were Yamato and now are Japanese. Yeah, there were many different Ainu languages. Now there's probably only a couple left, and many of them don't have any more sort of fluent speakers. The situation is similar, though better, in the Okinawan Islands, just because there were more people there. But there were there were Okinawan languages, which diverged from what is now modern Japanese, probably about like 2,000 years ago, according to linguistic reconstructions. I used to be into this, which is how I know. So there were sort of many different languages spoken in Okinawa. Many of them are now gone, but some of them survive. And people in Okinawa now, they obviously all can speak standard Japanese, but there's also kind of a local variant of standard Japanese, which is known as Okinawa Ben, Okinawa dialect, which is different than the Okinawan languages. It's complicated. On the other hand, it's not, the situation of the Ainu in particular is not uncomparable to that of Native Americans in this country or Canada. Okay. Okay. All right. So, that being said, as we said before, this is in Okayama Prefecture. Many Japanese towns and cities used to be, in fact, primarily canals, but as part of modernization, most major cities paved the canals over and turned them into streets. So only a few towns have now kept the canals. But again, due to the primacy of water transport and the difficulty of keeping roads well graded in such a mountainous society, barges and boat transport was actually sort of much more important than in many other parts of the world. So Japan was, as we've said before, a frontier zone, a late bloomer, historically speaking. Because it is at the edge of this Eurasian landmass, it is sort of distant from the Eurasian cradles of civilization, of which Eurasia has 4 of the 6. The other 2 are in Central and South America. So in particular, civilization arose in China, what we now call the Shang Dynasty, around the Huanghe River Valley. This was sort of in the 3000s BC, if not earlier. But whereas we don't get written records of Japan until the 200s Common Era, or AD, which are Chinese records of embassies sent to the islands. And so until then, in Japan, there was a Jomon society, which is sort of this blanket term for sort of everything that happened from about 10,000 to about 300 BCE, which was based on the natural resources that Japan does have. Here's a map of Japan and the world, a sort of 3D projection. Basically, at that point, they had a lot of forests. They had really good fish. They still have really good fish. They have a lot fewer forests now. As I mentioned before, the culture in the north is plugged into this nomadic complex, which is where you get horses and gold, Chinese brocade, deer hides, eagle feathers. In the central areas, what we have is trade with societies on the Korean Peninsula and in China, and they are obtaining from there iron, irrigated rice farming, which is a significant step up from the previous technique. We just sort of chucked the rice on the ground and hoped things happened. But it's also from Korea, for example, that they got horse gear, sort of bits and bridles and ways to ride horses, arms and armor, pottery, and then, of course, what in some ways are sort of the most important from our perspective, because they're what changed from sort of pre-recorded history to recorded history, Buddhism and writing. Okay. And the relationship with Korea is actually also worth sort of emphasizing. The Korean Peninsula, for a while, was dominated by Han China. That sort of fell apart in the early first millennium as the Han Kingdom weakened. I'm not going to give you a whole précis of Chinese history, because you can look it up on Wikipedia. But in Korea, there were sort of multiple kingdoms vying for control with one another. Japan, and well, the Yamato Society in Japan developed a particularly close relationship with one of them called Paekche. And my Korean is atrocious, so I'm probably sort of not pronouncing it correctly. Over time, Japan sort of functioned, because it was far enough away from the peninsula. It offered a refuge for people from the Korean peninsula from sort of internal court squabbles. When Paekche falls, eventually the Japanese society absorbs a huge influx of skilled artisans, as well as sort of aristocratic families. This is why, for example, when the Heisei emperor, who's scheduled to abdicate at the end of next year, he actually acknowledged, I think a couple decades ago, that way back in the day, one of his ancestors had married a Paekche princess, which is nothing more than what was already known from the historical record and the chronicles. But even his acknowledgement of the fact that there had been intermarriage between, what is now venerated as the imperial house and Korean royalty sort of got a lot of nationalists very unhappy. But in keeping with the new historical standards, it's important to recognize that there was sort of much more trade and interconnectedness, even from Japan all the way here at the end of the world, quite literally, even all the way to what was the old Roman Empire. One theory, for example, is that the Japanese word for purple, murasaki, which is a noun, which is weird. One theory is that it actually comes from the Latin murex, which is the name for the shell that you get the dye for the purple robes from. It's just a theory, there's no way to prove it, but certainly, in the very sort of early eras of Japanese history, the 500s, 600s, 700s, in Yamato, in Nara, and what then became Kyoto, they're wearing Tang-style clothing. They're very much plugged into the end of this old Silk Road circuit, which was weakened by the fall of the Roman and the Han empires, but never extinguished entirely. Okay, I'm almost to the hinge of the talk. This is Kamakura. So here is that more detailed map of ancient Japan, sort of the western half where most things happen, until the later medieval period, when finally stuff starts pushing east and north. So here, again, I should color this map at some point. It's a little hard to tell, but the islands versus the sea. But here is Kyushu, here's Shikoku, here's Honshu. And this, of course, is the Kinki, or capital area region. So Heijo, yes, Heijo is the old word for Nara. Nagaoka was the capital for like 10 years. They don't like to talk about it. And then Heian was the word of the time for what's now called Kyoto. So this collectively is the Yamato region. The other major sort of possible rival to the Yamato region in sort of prestige and sociopolitical terms was the Izumo Confederacy. This is the Sea of Japan coast, which is partly why they lost and Yamato won. Again, so here's the inland sea. You can go all the way up there, right to Osaka, Naniwa, as it was called at the time. It's 30 miles from Osaka to Kyoto. And Dazaifu, of course, is the chief city of Kyushu at the time. It's close to modern Fukuoka, but not quite the same. And the Hyuga Confederacy, this area is now, Miyazaki City is there. They market themselves as the heartland of ancient Japan, the land of myths, Shinwan no Kuni. And it's true that a lot of the sort of recorded myths about the Shinto deities do in fact seem to take place in and around this area, or are identified with locations there. So again, as is briefly mentioned in the smallpox reading, Kyushu was sort of this older center because of its close links with China and Korea. As time went on, the power shifted towards this area. Okay, so another maritime view. This is on the inland sea, looking back towards, that's Honshu back there. So why didn't they colonize East Asia? Why didn't East Asia colonize America if they were so great? Well, another saying amongst geographers is that seas unite but oceans divide. Basically, before you had steam power, if you went out into the Pacific, you weren't coming back. And specifically, there's this thing called the North Pacific Gyre, which is this great ginormous current. The Great Pacific Trash Heap, which may or may not ever have existed, was said to have floated in this gyre ceaselessly. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly either. But again, it's this massive ocean current that is, if you do not have steam power, basically impossible to resist. For example, you know, there's stories in the 1900s and 1800s, rather, 19th century, of sailors who were sort of shipwrecked and sort of picked up by Western whaling ships in the Pacific, and sort of Japanese people who wound up randomly getting educations at colleges like Amherst or other places. And then they came back, but that was sort of because steam power then existed and they could go back. Before the invention of steam under sail or human power, if you go out that way, no. So people did not sail this way. They did, however, sail in these areas. So in the period we're talking about, particularly sort of in the 13th through 16th centuries, there's a lot of trade between these parts of Southeast Asia and Japan and China. But because of this huge current, no crossing the Pacific and coming back. Okay, thank you for more water. Okay. All right, so any other questions? Some of them actually already covered things I was going to say, so that was cool. Anything else? Yes?
Do you know why because I know that trade happened in the Atlantic because of that same current system. Do you know why it was more productive in the Atlantic?
Right. Well, so this ocean is a lot smaller. It's possible to get around it even sort of in the absence of steam power. This area is still kind of the doldrums, you know how there's no current there. That was kind of a problem for a long time. But I mean, many of sort of the early explorers, the Vikings, for example, actually sort of went against this current and sort of island hopped and then went back the same way. basically, people start making this trip once they realize it's possible. And they also have a pretty strong incentive to make the trip because of the fantastic amount of gold and silver that they're mining from these areas. And I mean, also like what motivated people like Columbus and Cortez, again, was this sort of absolute bloodlust for gold, which you read about, and it's like deeply pathological. Like, what is wrong? I don't get it, like quite literally. But they knew it was possible, basically. And at that point, even though, again, it was sort of a risky venture, many of the Spanish treasure fleets sank or were preyed upon by pirates. Another thing they also did was developed, as I'm sure you remember, the triangle trade. So go from like here to here, slaves, refuel in the Caribbean, trade the slaves for sugar/molasses, there, go back, go off, back to England. So not trying to make sort of one major trip. That's one answer, yeah.
What about the Polynesians? Did the Polynesians navigate through the North Pacific here, or at least
Yeah.
the way? They didn't make it all the way, obviously, but
They made it to Hawaii.
yeah, they made it good.
No, they're super great, like fantastic. No, I mean, and again, which is part of the reason why for a long time, these stories of, Polynesians navigating with, sort of oral history and sail power, was not believed. But they did make it. And that's, entirely because they had this sort of navigation method that allowed them to know where they were going and not miss, which is fantastic. But the Japanese, didn't have, or other sort of societies along this rim didn't have the sort of same knowledge of seafaring. And yeah, Japan, they had a lot of sort of smaller vessels, but none of the ones that were really sort of suited for like major ocean-going voyages. Though you could argue that like the European sailing ships that went from here to there, or Magellan went around the world, and were also not actually well suited for major ocean-going voyages. But yeah, no, that's another good question. Okay. All right, so moving into the historical period, this slide's a little hard to read, but I'm attached to the photo, which is of one of the formal gardens in Shikoku. I want to go back. Right. I mentioned the Spanish treasure fleets, which are very famous as sources of world gold. But in fact, I wanted to specifically mention that even during the sort of height of the Spanish metal extraction from the Americas in 1540 to 1640 CE, Japan was actually supplying 1/3 of the world's new silver. So silver was one thing that people in China wanted, and that Japan actually managed to have a lot of for a while. So to feed trade with China, it was extracted from the Japanese mountains and sent through these circuits, transshipped from China on and on and on and on and on until it gets to silversmiths in Europe. So this is sort of one thing to keep in mind. Japan nowadays, and since sort of the Meiji period, has been known as this kind of natural resource poor country. That's partly because its metals were sort of largely mined out, as well as silver. Copper was also a major metal export for a long time. Its metals were basically mined out by the modern period, though. However, they were able to make a go of copper mining once they got industrial mining techniques. At one point, one mine in Japan was supplying 5% of the world's copper in the 1890s. And you can imagine the industrial pollution from that was as bad as you'd expect. That's another story. Okay. All right, so the 10 key dates of Japanese history, you could take others for sure, but these are some good ones. So 645, the beginning of the so-called Taika reforms, which your textbooks probably paint as sort of one event that happened one time with this definitive group of dudes. In actuality, it was more like the first of sort of a 3-phase process. And some of the people who are said to have been there are clearly written in after the fact, when the chronicles were actually written several hundred years later. to elevate people who had since become powerful but were not at the time, specifically the Fujiwara family. So the Yamato state in the 640s and before that as well had been plagued by this sort of chronic instability in terms of the monarch. They were frequently assassinated or forced to retire, partly because if you read the histories, there was sort of no strong preference in terms of who got to be monarch. It could go to women, it could go to men, it could go to sons, daughters, wives, frequently sort of aunts and wives were the same thing, or uncles and sons. There was a lot of intermarriage. It was a large, complicated family. Because of this, there was sort of a lot of chronic instability. And Suiko and Shotoku actually sort of, one of the reasons they get a lot of press is that they were actually a fairly stable pair. Suiko, of course, was the monarch, and Shotoku was her sort of right-hand guy. And that's also a fairly common pattern, is that there's a female monarch and a right-hand male regent kind of structure. But 645, on the Korean peninsula at this time, the Tang dynasty, or what is becoming the Tang dynasty in China, is sort of ramping up. Korea, there's a lot of conflict. Paekche is looking weak. So the first of the so-called Taika reforms starts and continues through the next couple of decades to consolidate the Yamato state along Tang lines. And this is very much kind of a civilizational technology transfer move. The Tang dynasty is rich and powerful. There are legitimate fears in the Japanese islands that after they finish sort of having their Korean allies consolidate the peninsula, that they will then turn their eyes to Japan. So as part of this sort of Tang adoption, they adopt, as you're well aware, many Tang governmental customs, practices, basically everything except the Tang concept of the meritocracy, the sort of examination system that bureaucrats needed to go through to get positions in the government. In Japan, that would have messed with the hereditary aristocracy, so they didn't do that. But by the end of it, by the reign of sort of one of the last sovereigns of this Taika era, Jito and her husband, who dies before her, I can never remember his name, but Jito, she was probably the first one who was actually called Tenno, or emperor, to their face. Before that, they had a long sort of native Japanese term, which translates to like great king, the short version. So that's 645. In 710, Nara is established as the first permanent capital. It's called Nara now. At the time, it was called Heijō-kyo, which is something like Citadel of Peace. And after 710, they're in the Nara era for 84 years. In 794, the capital moves to Kyoto, which at the time was called Heian, which also means peaceful reign. And this is the beginning of what's called the Heian period. And the capital never technically moves from Kyoto until 1872. So they almost made it to 1200 years. So the Heian period is also known as sort of classical Japan. Many sort of courtly arts are at their height. The Tang-style bureaucracy that was established does its thing. Many parts about it start to decay very quickly, partly through the smallpox epidemic, as we read about in the readings. The Tang bureaucracy was set up to sort of manage this larger population, and then in the 730s, it's devastated by smallpox. And a lot of the ways that things changed after the smallpox to deal with the smaller population sort of set up a lot of later changes. So for example, one thing that was in the Tang system was that peasants didn't technically own their own land. The concept under the Tang dynasty was that the land would belong to the peasants for their lifetime. And then once the peasant householders died, the state would take it back and reassign it to somebody else. That system was practiced in Japan probably for a couple of decades, but after the smallpox, they gave it up. And the smallpox epidemic chapter is also sort of a good example of the ways in which Japan's closeness, being close enough to the Eurasian landmass, kept it in these circuits of disease and exchange, which, as I think people who study the history of Native Americans know, being isolated in terms of disease had a huge deleterious effect on those peoples once they came into contact with these Eurasian diseases. But because Japan was close enough to contract them, Obviously, they killed a lot of people, but they did eventually then become endemic in the population. And so measles and smallpox became, by the 1200s, the medieval era, sort of diseases of childhood, which certainly killed a good chunk of people. But once you had them as a child, you would then, live and be fine. You'd have smallpox scars, but everybody had them, so it didn't matter. That's another reason to, wear the full white face makeup and blacken your teeth. So, and I also, I like Ferris a lot, and I think the way he talks about the sort of documents and what he does to them, it's a good window into sort of one way of going about historical research and historical analysis. So, 1185, probably a date I think most of you are familiar with. The end of the Genpei Wars. Did anything actually happen in 1185? Well, probably. Was the Genpei War a war? Maybe. Depends how you define it. But certainly after this point, there is what's known as the Kamakura Bakufu, the shogunate. This is traditionally dated as the start of the medieval period. Though in many ways, sort of the story of kind of political devolution and fragmentation of this more centralized sort of society, it takes several hundred years. But by 1467, which is the beginning of the Onin Wars in Kyoto, which is this 10-year conflict fought in and around the city, which turns it basically into a series of armed and fortified camps. 1467 is the beginning of what's been called the Sengoku, or Warring States period, which is kind of misleading. It's borrowed from Chinese history, describing the spring and autumn period before the establishment of unified China under Qin Shi Huangdi, that jerk. But certainly the Sengoku period is sort of this time of the war of sort of all against all. Basically, local warlords vie for control. There is still a shogunate in Kyoto, but the shogun is very weak, and sort of only people in Kyoto pay attention to him, and they mostly ignore him anyway. So you get sort of, depending on how you date it, more than a century of sort of armed conflict, which eventually comes to an end in 1600 when the last of the three unifiers, Tokugawa Ieyasu, he gains control of this reunified country. So this, for historians, is the start of early modern Japan. And there's a joke about Ieyasu because he built on the work of two people who came before him, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. So the joke is that Nobunaga is the guy who pounded the mochi, which if you've ever made mochi or see it being seen, you have to pound it for a long time to get it to sort of break down and get to that perfect glutinous texture. And then Hideyoshi is the guy who shapes the mochi, but Tokugawa Ieyasu is the dude who actually got to eat it. And there's another one about nightingales and being threatening to birds. Nobunaga was a very terrifying figure, but I can never remember how that one goes. So another thing to note about sort of the Onin Wars, the Sengoku period, is it is this sort of century of disorder. It's also sort of the century in which Japan, sort of as a, sort of a society, is kind of the most engaged with trade and the outside world until the late 1800s. This is the era in which Christian missionaries show up in Japan. They make a huge inroads, preaching and converting in Kyushu in particular, though also in Kyoto. There were a couple significant monasteries there, which of course, by the 1630s, under the Tokugawa shogunate, a policy of Christian intolerance was proclaimed, which lasted until the 1870s. It was seen as sort of this foreign influence that wasn't well suited to being dominated by existing power structures, unlike Buddhism, which after Nobunaga was very mean to a bunch of monks, was in fact quite capable of serving the state. And Buddhist temples in particular became very closely allied with the Tokugawa regime. You were registered as an existing person through your Buddhist temple, which is why beginning in the Meiji period in 1868, when the descendants of the losers from 1600 and a bunch of other disaffected low-ranking samurai got together and overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate because it was very well suited for early modern society. but it was not well suited to deal with the demands of powers such as the United States and Great Britain, which wanted trade access, whaling rights, various other things, and which in the 1850s and 1860s were basically directly threatening Japanese politicians with, look at what we did to China. You don't want that to happen to you. Sign our treaties. And since China was basically, as they call it, semi-colonized, or colonized in everything but name, particularly after the Second Opium War, people in Japan paid attention, which is how you get the response of forming the Japanese Empire. The late 19th century, this very cutthroat social Darwinist world, you know, the people who are strong have an empire, and the people who don't, they get colonized. So eat or be eaten, Japan established the only sort of native Asian empire, which lasted for a very long, actually only 50 years. Came to an end in 1945. And of course, we're all familiar with the atomic bombings, though what ended the war, as far as historians can tell, is actually the Soviet invasion of Manchukuo, the puppet state on the continent. So after that is post-war Japan, as you might imagine. It's also democratic Japan. The post-war constitution guarantees everyone, all Japanese citizens, the right to vote. It's parliamentary democracy, largely along the lines of Great Britain. And it worked very well for a long time. Japanese society in the post-war was set up for GDP, in terms of economic recovery initially, which then became a philosophy of economic growth, which worked for 40 years. The miracle, as it was called, and then ended in what was known as the bubble, the asset bubble in the late 80s. If you've heard that song, Turning Japanese, that was why. Japanese companies bought Rockefeller Center. They also bought Columbia Records, you know, home of Bruce Springsteen. Many other sort of, there were fears that Japan was going to become number one. There was actually a book called Japan is Number One, that America would sort of lose its place. And this was actually, ironically, partly because the post-war constitution says Japan is a peaceful nation. They don't have a standing army. They do, however, have the most technologically advanced military in the world. It's just known as the Self-Defense Forces. But basically the upshot of that was that Japan was outsourcing a large portion of its defense costs to the United States. So they were able to put that extra capital directly into economic growth. And it worked until 1991. New Year's Day is sort of conventionally dated as the beginning of that, but the real estate market gradually deflated. The asset price bubble burst. Japan since has been known as been in what is called the lost decades, which is sort of, I mean, at this point, 25, almost 30 years of deflation, population stagnation, now shrinkage, lowered real incomes over time. Many of the same phenomenon of sort of the millennial generation in this country were sort of seen earlier amongst Japanese youth before the 2008 Great Recession. And in 2011, to top it all off, was the triple disaster of 3/11. So this was the Great Tohoku earthquake, which is the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, a 9.0, which I think is one of the top 5 strongest ever recorded. Certainly the most powerful earthquake to strike the country since 867, which is when some of the markers in the area about tsunami heights were laid down. And of course, there was a devastating tsunami and as well the Fukushima nuclear meltdowns, the greatest nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, and the only one to be ranked 7 alongside Chernobyl on the IAEA's disaster scale. So that is the very sort of short version of Japanese history. So basically, what we care about in this institute is sort of the column on the left. But if there are any questions about any of that or anything on the right, I'm certainly happy to give answers as far as I can.
How would you define an
going out and making other people do what you want.
Would you say that Japan was an empire?
Oh yeah, for sure. So they start basically kind of beating up on Korea from the late 1870s, kind of because they can. And they also have very much this idea that, you know, if you were either an empire or a subject, a colonized subject, and basically if they're sort of looking around for people to beat up on, it's really Korea or nobody, because China is already being beat up on by the European and American powers. Very fortuitously, the Joseon dynasty in Korea at that point was pretty weak. Partly it was weak because of the Japanese invasions at the end of the 1500s, had sort of wrought structural damage on Korea's economy and society that never fully were recovered from. So how's that for irony? So yeah, they start beating up on Japan in the Korea in the 1870s. They get into a sort of contest first with China and then Russia over who is going to call the shots in Korea. So in 1894 to 95, first war with China, they eat China's lunch pretty easily. China gives them Taiwan in 1895 as the first formal colony. 10 years later, 1904 to 1905, is the Russo-Japanese War, when Russia was like, well, you know, the peasants are restless, let's beat up on Japan. It didn't go well for them. And this is sort of the event that announces to the rest of the world that Japan is kind of now a modern power to be taken seriously. They get a military alliance with Great Britain out of it, which when Britain enters World War I is what gets Japan, Germany's colonies in Asia. They go take them basically because they could. World War I was really good for Japan. It sucked for everybody else, but they also were selling arms to the combatants in Europe and replacing European products on world markets. So it was kind of a boom economy, actually. And Japan is allowed to keep those possessions either as colonies outright or as League of Nations mandates at the Peace of Versailles. So at that point they had Taiwan. Korea was annexed in 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War, a protectorate first, and then fully annexed in 1910. So Korea is also an outright colony. It was run as a breadbasket, basically. So most of the rice that was grown in the country was sent back to the home islands to feed Japanese people, with the result that Korean people weren't the same height again as they had been in 1910 until like the 1960s. So a very direct loss of calories and stature there. And then partly as a consequence of the Russo-Japanese War, and then also as a consequence of China collapsing at the end of the Qing dynasty, they also acquired an increasingly large sphere of influence in Northeast Asia, which eventually, through a series of shenanigans, is converted into the puppet state of Manchukuo from 31. So yes, definitely an empire. Actually a really interesting one, because in many ways it was sort of run on a different spatial logic than some of the others from the same time period. But that's a whole other course. But yeah, definitely an empire. Yeah, and so technically as well, like everybody was a Japanese subject, but the colonized people were like second-class subjects. So, but there's also the argument that the way Japan modernized was to sort of treat the countryside as an internal colony, to feed the cities, much as sort of the colonies were sort of treated as, you know, sort of production centers to feed the home islands. That's also very true. So by the 1920s, you know, people in Tokyo are sort of living, in some ways, a very Great Gatsby kind of life. You know, Tokyo, Berlin, London, Paris, New York, they all kind of look very similar. But if you went out into the countryside, you would find that sort of the standards of living hadn't changed from the 1860s, which, you know, by 1860 standards, the standards of living in the countryside were quite good. By 1920s urban standards, they were very bad. So that's sort of another angle to the modernization. But it was definitely better to be a Japanese person in the Japanese Empire than to be a colonized person. So there's that.
I'm also curious if you have maybe interesting facts or interesting stories, because although I really appreciate this like 10-point span of like 1,000 years of Japanese history, like what are like gender roles or women or some alternate histories or revolutions
Yeah, I can tell a story about women and gender roles in culture. A lot of people actually consider Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari, to be the world's first novel. She started writing it probably around the year 1000. She was a court lady in the Heian era. She and Sei Shonagon, who wrote the Pillow Book, which is sort of the other major non-poetry text, because poetry was the way educated people sort of judged themselves and communicated and socialized up until about the 1880s, when prose became more of a thing. Sei Shonagon and Murasaki Shikibu served rival empresses. Murasaki's empress won, and her son became the imperial heir. Sei Shonagon's empress lost and actually died quite young, which is interesting because Murasaki's novel is a lot more sort of melancholy than Sei Shonagon's text, which is very sort of peppy and sarcastic. And in fact, when people in the modern era were sort of looking for a national Japanese literature, and by people I mean men, because they were almost all men, they wound up going back to these Heian era texts, which were written by women. And because they were written by women who were by convention sort of not supposed to write in Chinese, because Chinese was the language of bureaucracy and government, and women were not supposed to be involved in such things. They were allegedly not supposed to be even taught Chinese, but it's clear that highly educated women did. Both Sei Shonagon and Murasaki almost certainly knew Chinese, for example. But so dudes in the modern period are looking back to women in the ancient period for this sort of national literature. So they wind up kind of enshrining this canon of women writers, as well as some male writers who took on female personae to be able to write in sort of the native Japanese idiom or poetic forms. So that's kind of one irony about sort of Japanese literature and the way it's evolved. Though, of course, these texts were treated as classics from the medieval period. There's whole sort of textual families, textual scholarly sources. But another way to tell this history of Japan, and I don't think there's really sort of one book that does it, though maybe I should write it, is actually sort of to look at it as sort of bringing over patriarchy from China, as well as sort of all these other civilizational structures and technologies. I mentioned earlier this sort of pattern of the dyad of like the female sovereign and the male kind of assistant ruler. The first ruler of Japan that is mentioned in the Chinese chronicles is actually a shaman queen named Himiko, or depending on how you transcribe it, Pimiko. It's the same sound. So she's mentioned in the Chinese chronicles as this great queen, who's more, rules well and wisely and is mourned by her people when she dies. And a female cousin is said to actually have succeeded her in these same Chinese chronicles. So there's actually a lot of evidence that Japan, the Yamato society was actually sort of fairly gender equal. So there were 8 female emperors in recorded history, 7 of whom reigned before 794. And this is again testament to the fact that sort of this idea of kind of male inheritance was clearly sort of weaker or non-existent, and was imported along with Buddhism, which does have this sort of very kind of masculinist ideology. There's a whole question of like, can women be saved or are they too dirty? That's a whole sort of other story about medieval Buddhism in Japan in particular. But one thing that happened was that Japanese sovereigns, as a way to kind of exert their power over sort of both monks and sort of other aristocrats, wound up adopting this kind of priest-king persona. They would frequently take kind of lay vows while they were on the throne, and then after they would retire and become like officially ordained. And this pattern actually becomes even more codified in the Heian era, when retired emperors actually wind up sort of becoming major political figures. Because the figure of the emperor was controlled by other families, and so the emperor was frequently like a teenager or a child who was kept around long enough to father the next emperor and then forced to retire. But of course, because in Buddhism women can't be priests, they can be nuns in some kinds of Buddhism, but they can't be priests, so they can't be priest kings, and particularly not in esoteric Buddhism, which is the kind of Buddhism that came in first. that sort of tends to shut women out of political power. And another thing that sort of seems to have happened is that as they adopted these sort of Tang practices of bureaucracy, of village registration, of all these kinds of reports that were to be sent to the capital, you know, in the Tang era, which actually was also sort of fairly gender neutral for Chinese history, but was still definitely patriarchal. China, of course, has had Confucianism as a major social influence since the Warring States period, when Confucius was writing and was coming up with his philosophy as a way to kind of solve the problems of the Warring States period in China. So these forms of documents and reports came over from China, and you know, they were always supposed to talk about, like, they were supposed to use Chinese, and Chinese doesn't have like sort of words for female chieftains. They just used the like word for male chieftain, even though, for example, you know, it was like a sort of a more matriarchal structure in which like a woman was the head of a productive unit, and sort of, you know, men were not the center of these clan units, and it was sort of, there was kind of more of a matriarchal element going on, and you can see some traces of this in marriage practices in the Heian era. That's another story. But over time, you know, as patriarchy and sort of Chinese culture become more and more sort of adapted as the default, you know, eventually, like, as they keep writing these reports about like male chieftains, you know, and like you don't use the word for female chieftain because it doesn't exist in Chinese, you know, then you kind of get this idea of like, oh, chieftains must be men. So there's a process like that going on. There's also a process going on as Buddhism sort of from the high Heian period into like the medieval era. One thing that happens is that various monks decide to go out and start preaching to the common people and like actually get them to know things about religion and the Buddha. We want to save their souls. They also bring, you start to get more and more sort of tales about monks and lecherous monks and how women are kind of like tempting them away from, you know, this sort of path to enlightenment. And this is sort of a main feature of, you know, medieval Buddhist stories. You know, women are seen as sort of, you know, even if it's not sort of like inherently morally their fault, it becomes their fault later. You know, by their sort of nature, they have this physical, fleshly existence. You know, various monthly cycles go on. It distracts the priests from, you know, the monks from their sort of contemplation of how to get out of suffering, basically. So women begin to be seen as kind of like inherently sort of less enlightenable. Though there are sort of other sorts of popular Buddhism where it's like, oh, if you just say the name of Buddha, you'll be saved. Like that one obviously appealed to women a lot more. But over time, patriarchy does sort of become more and more of a thing. Women's property rights among the aristocracy degrade pretty heavily from 794, you know, from this era until by the Sengoku era, they basically have no more property rights. It used to be that women inherited houses and sort of controlled family resources. Over the course of the medieval era in particular, those rights are eroded completely, and men become the heads of household. And then that's when you start to see sort of these sort of concepts of like, in, you know, the samurai stories, like, oh, you know, the wife married in and she is always part of her father's family, you know, even after she has born children and, you know, whatever. By sort of the 14 or 1500s, yeah. So there's a whole sort of kind of constellation of things you can look at.
During this period, could women own businesses, run and own businesses, or just households?
I mean, they didn't really have businesses. Like in sort of the early eras, you know, women seem to have run sort of like productive household units, you know. By sort of the end of, by the medieval period, when you get sort of more internal commerce happening, village cooperatives exist, but like, you know, the people who have the seats in the village cooperatives are dudes, basically. And the dudes are the ones who are the merchants sort of going out and doing the thing. Women did have sort of a much sort of better life in some ways, even through the Edo period. At least if you weren't an aristocrat. If you were an aristocrat, things kind of sucked, or a samurai rather, since they were the aristocracy at that point. But, you know, rates of literacy were very high for both men and women in the Edo era. And the Edo era, the Tokugawa period, also reached a pretty high standard of living for pre-modern society. So that was cool. That was definitely, because again, there sort of wasn't this emphasis on war from this time period. This is sort of entirely, almost entirely, sort of internal economic development. It's the Pax Tokugawa is what it's sometimes called. So there is sort of a lot of popular culture going on, and it was sort of possible to have fun, even if you were a commoner. And women were sort of a huge part of economic production in that era too. Though you'll see those ukiyo-e prints of like women in the print shop, and it's like those roles were actually mostly filled by dudes, but like people didn't want to look at dudes in the ukiyo-e prints. They wanted to see the women in the pretty kimonos. So it's kind of misleading on the face of it, but we have to end, don't we?
Went a little over.
Yeah.
That's